started. Our thanks to the HILT Conference for giving us this opportunity. This is a workshop on collaborative learning. And to get us started, Beth Altringer is going to get the conversation started.
Great. So one thing we want to get out of the way is what do we actually mean by collaboration? And kicking that off, what do we not mean? So we don't mean agreeableness. We don't mean this concept grouping. We don't necessarily mean a touchy-feely way of working together. We don't mean a method that is free of conflict. We mean working together effectively toward goals, and this could work in many different ways. And the way that we've organized this session is to actually expose you to the different ways that we have structured this in our own classrooms. And I want to briefly talk about a concept called constructive controversy, which probably many of you are familiar with, but when I think about collaboration, that's what I'm thinking about. And it's this iterative process of searching for understanding, drawing conclusions, stating your case, hearing different conclusions, feeling uncertain, and going back and forth. And I do a lot of research on top teams in the area of collaborative forms of innovation. And what we find in those teams is they all demonstrate this, rather than an agreeable form of collaboration. So the way that we're structuring each of our presentations at the start of this is around a general concept of the process of problem solving. We're all from very different disciplines. So that basically is, there's some problem definition in the beginning. There's some way of grouping the individuals involved. There's an initial work phase, coming up with some ideas for what you're going to do, and then you need to narrow them down, create a deliverable, and then there's an evaluative and feedback phase. So I'm going to kick off with my experience, and then we're each going to share ours from there. My experience actually comes from what I did before academia. So I learned a lot from professional projects that I worked on in the area of the built environment. And one of these was a project on how might we upgrade urban slums, and this was in the Cape Flats of South Africa. Another project was with Gucci Group and Parry, the company that owns them, and Puma, and it was looking at how might we make sustainability the new luxury. A third project was on how might we fast-track urban and economic development in South Africa using the World Cup. All of these projects shared several things in common. There was never a shortage of good ideas. There was never a shortage of talented people. There was never a shortage of skilled people. But there was a shortage of something like their ability to work together in a way that the best ideas could penetrate the organizational and political systems of these projects. And that was really, frustrating to me, but it was also very interesting to me. And ultimately, I wanted to start to create courses that can help students prepare for and succeed in these environments when they have really good ideas. So it's clearly not just about ideas and talent. It's also about navigating organizations and politics. And this matters because most projects fail. So a lot of my research has been inside companies like IDEO that innovate for other companies. They have an explicitly collaborative approach to doing this. And even in this company, as we'll see, projects succeed only about 30% of the time. The rate broadly is failure happens 70 to 90% of the time. So I'm really interested in how might we identify barriers to ongoing innovation in collaborative settings, identify how top groups deal with them, and rethink how we educate the next generation. So one of my classes, the class that I teach this fall, is called the Innovators Practice. And the class is actually based on research in real projects, over 350 projects. They're all multidisciplinary, and they come from all over the world. And when you talk to participants, they describe a successful project usually emerging from this. You have talented people, they communicate well, they trust each other, they get to work on interesting projects, and if that's all true, they're successful most of the time. How many of you are in this type of project most of the time? pretty high. Usually the problem is we're not in this type of project, and then what do you do? And we have a lot less research on that. So researchers add a little bit to the way that we think about this, and it's an iterative process where these factors relating to individual and team creativity, which are domain expertise, creative ability, and intrinsic motivation, that is, you're interested in the project, influence the work environment to enable those individuals to create innovation. That work environment needs to consist of basic resources and management practice and organizational motivation to facilitate innovation. We know several things about that. And that enables individual and team creativity. Likewise, it affects the workday environment, which Teresa Maguire over the business school has done some great work showing how our everyday work environment influences our emotion, which in turn can influence our ability to be creative. From those 350 projects, about 32% of them were successful, which matches what the rest of the research says. Another 25% of them were above average, meaning everybody is satisfied with the result. And the rest of them failed, but for different reasons. And these reasons are largely due to interpersonal dynamics. All of the people in these projects are very successful and working for top companies or have the capacity to be very successful. So this class is designed to build on that and create an environment that can teach students to get better at that. So the students think the class is about this, designing something that excites you, that fits into and potentially improves people's lives, and has real-world measurable impact within the constraints of this class. And I think it's about this, teaching students to manage uncertainty, understand their own intrinsic motivation, recognize decision-making biases, effectively collaborate across disciplines, manage their expectations for a different type of course, adapt to unanticipated needs as these evolve throughout the term, escalate autonomy so at the end they don't actually need me, and triangulate feedback for their own personal development. And so if I think about what happens in regular organizations, you have individuals, you have groups, you have some form of organization, they research the problem, and then they build something. So I learned from two different models before building this course, and one was when I was at the D School at Stanford, and we did a lot of short workshops. And those involved grouping and building, but it was a little superficial on both sides of that. And it wasn't quite what I wanted to create, at least for my goals. And another version of that was a blue sky innovation course that had an international component. And that was very good on the group side, pretty good on the research side. On the research side, the professors decided what problems you worked on. Students were able to choose their own groups, but what happened is they tended to choose their friends and pretty superficial interests in the problems they wanted to solve. And we know that that doesn't tend to lead to the best outcomes in the long term for groups. And the students were as interested in the international component as they were in their own projects. And so I wanted to build something that was more focused on the organizational side. And so every year of this class, I have built on this model. So it includes all of these. The first 2 weeks, the students spend time figuring out what their personal interests have been over time. They're grouped to maximize shared interests and diverse skills, which is something I think we'll be talking about later today, how you might do that in your own context. They then use behavioral research, so to overcome confirmation bias, they actually go out into the field for 4 to 6 weeks to study their area of interest before even coming up with ideas. And there's a reason why you might use that approach versus a more professor interest-driven approach. And then they build their ideas. And ultimately, every year I've made all of my decisions as an instructor
more and more transparent to the students, because ultimately my goal is that they can recreate an organization that supports this, rather than the focus just being on their project. So I'll stop there.
Thank you very much for having me. I feel honored to be a part of this. So I'm going to talk about network collections and collaborative learning. I've added the parentheses S because I mean collecting, the act of collection, and the creation of collections. Not usually a fan of the parentheses used in titles, but I thought it was particularly appropriate. So I am going to be revolving around this six plus schematic that we will be exploring in the exercises to come. The concept here, which I will return to and kind of flesh out, is the act of collecting preceding a class environment. So taking a top-down kind of concept of giving students examples and readings and having them come to class, and flipping it to the idea of having students go out, collect examples on their own, multimedia, collect examples of cultural objects, examples of news articles. It depends on the context of the course. Come to class with analyses in mind, work in groups, and do a kind of more emergent form of learning. So I'll come back to this. I'm a humanist, so I tend to come up with phrases that no one else has ever used, or if they have, they mean something else by it. But I'll return to these at the end to kind of think through what I imagine sort of collections or object-based learning to afford. So the course that I'm going to be talking about, I'm going to do a very close reading of one particular week that myself and the professors I co-taught with carried out. And the course was on the disasters in Japan in 2011. It was in fall 2013. And students were involved in, it was a practice-based course, in producing multimedia presentations using an editor, a collections editor made by a colleague of mine at a group called MetaLab at Harvard, Jessica Yurkovsky. And this is an example. So what are we building upon? These are disasters of extraordinary consequence, impact, and complexity. They were also disasters with an unprecedented amount of digital output. Tweets during the event, which affected people's ability to get help, people communicating around nuclear protests, people communicating and sharing articles, imagery, and so forth. So there's a mass of records, and it's continuing to grow. So in light of this, there have been a number of archival responses to the events and to this mass of records, both the idea of seizing upon these records and contending with them. One such example is the East Japan Earthquake Archive. And like many of the other projects, these are archives, in a sense, beyond access, beyond accessing discrete materials. They produce forms of interaction. In this case, numerous forms of media, images, videos, short testimonials, and so forth have been gathered together into a Google Earth environment. And it creates something strange, something challenging, something that we don't really have the tools to think about. And it's called a pluralistic archive. So this is a sort of form of collecting open to publics who may be interested in confronting these disasters in modes outside of typical media channels. So at Harvard, there's been a project, and this is the basis of the course, to do another kind of archival response, which is to produce a networked or participatory archive. This archive. All right, I'll just continue talking and see if I can conjure images in your mind. So this archive is networked and participatory. This means that there are 1.2 million items referenced. It aggregates references to those items. It doesn't actually hold or preserve those items. Why does it do that? Well, it does this to allow these kind of participatory acts. So a user, a student, anyone who has access to the web can gather together items, images, tweets, videos into collections. So it's a curatorial practice that they're involved in. Furthermore, people can use what's called a bookmarklet to grab things off of the web and bring them into the archive. I had an image up here of the act of using the bookmarklet to bring in a video that TEPCO had produced, a surveillance video of Fukushima and the activities there. In fact, they're producing new videos every 30 seconds, recording from the very same angle of the activities there. Astonishing. So all this to say that our course, returning to this media and disaster theme that we had on a given week, the top-down model, we recognize that by having chosen 4 or 5 examples of media representations of the disaster and having about 3 articles was not picking up on the core affordances of the thing that we were working with. In fact, it was completely the opposite of its spirit. And so what we decided to do was to follow effectively that kind of 6-tier or 6-piece schematic where we had students go out and do collecting on their own. So they went into the wilds of the web and found all kinds of material related to media and disaster. So it could be a journalist's criticism of media representation. It could be a Fox News sort of horrifically biased kind of report on something taking place at Fukushima, anything like this. And these were brought together into a collection that the entire class was working on together. So it was a collection, media and disaster. So having done this, students could look at what their fellow students had referenced and aggregated together. But what we did when they came to class was break them off into groups of 3 and have them discuss their findings, discuss the objects they had found and their sort of critical perspectives that they were already developing. And they were developing these not having read the readings that we were planning on giving them. So it was more of what I think of as a kind of emergent criticality that's working through the act of collecting, which is something that we're kind of constantly involved in but don't think of as such. So having broken off into 3 groups, the students came back together and each presented with the objects they had collected on screen. And so they shared what patterns they had recognized, what controversies they found, what they disagreed on as a group, and so forth. I hope this is legible without slides. And what was fascinating is that the ideas that were generated in that process were profoundly more interesting than we had found in the readings. We were able to think about bias in ways that were more complex than the readings had laid out. We were able to think about the effects of social media in many varied terms. And there was a kind of level of energy to the discussion that one wouldn't have with a kind of set, prescribed set of readings that students are perceiving as not necessarily their own construction. So having done these presentations, we had a discussion for an hour. And generally speaking, the kind of ideas, as I said, that we were able to come to were much more powerful. But another element was this class had a legacy that was public-facing. So by doing these acts of collection, we now have a collection of 100 items that are powerful and could be used by anyone as the basis for some amount of research. So there's a kind of public legacy to the active collective learning. There are a number of other things that are on the slide that I would like to be able to talk about. I can actually just look through them here. That was quite all right. So I think just to take us away and come to a conclusion that one of the main things is exposing premises and biases. So students engaged in the act of collecting have to confront what they expect and what they actually end up finding. And they do so in ways that they wouldn't if they had read these articles on their own. I think there's another aspect, which is unexpected alternative paths. So I'm thinking about media and disaster. I'm going out and collecting. I'm thinking about my fellow students. But what if I encounter something that makes total sense for my research project? And it's a matter of having been exposed to a different video on YouTube that I hadn't expected. And that video has to do with nuclear protest. So you're being kind of constantly exposed to other materials and other possible paths. So it's a kind of fractal research experience. It's very kind of provocative. There's also this element that I would think of as parallel process, which is that you're working for yourself, but you're also working for your fellow students. So there's a kind of anticipatory process taking place. I think there's a teachers as learners element to this. You're listening to your students, you're being provoked by them, and it's a conversation that's more than just I'm analyzing what you've done with reference to these readings that I understand because I've read them before. As I said, there's an afterlife, And I'll conclude there by just saying we're all collecting always everywhere. And I think that these kind of flipped collecting processes could be applied in many different settings, scientific, humanistic, social scientific, in creative writing. I can just imagine many, many scenarios. But I think at the core of this, process of emergent learning through collecting are really worth considering. Thank you.
The good news about this technical glitch is that my slides are horrible compared to what they have. And I genuinely mean that. So I'll just go ahead and get started. My name is Dustin Tingley. I'm an associate professor in the government department, and I teach a big class on an introduction to international relations. And the way I see international relations or politics more generally is that it's often about understanding how to work collaboratively, as well as how to work when the other guy is actually really your enemy, right? So it's not just this sort of friendly disagreement and constructive criticism. It's like, they might kill me, right? But different parts of the class then have different emphases. And part of the class is certainly more on different collaborative situations that are required in response to different foreign affairs events, okay? One of the things that I have done in this class, in part because it is offered through the Extension School as well, is try to think about how I can bring the collaborative experience that happens in my class between my students to the Extension School students. And so in some sense, this speaks to an issue that is a theme of this conference, which is about distance, okay? So one of the things that we did was that we would get a couple more cameramen in the classroom, and I would wear a GoPro. Those of you who don't know what a GoPro is, it's like a helmet cam, okay? And so in that sense then, while people are doing different collaborative projects, which I'll tell you about in a second, I'm able to go around with the crew and be able to catch that collaborative experience, so at a minimum, the Extension School students can have some of that, okay? Otherwise, it's just simply impossible for them to participate because they're in different time zones, et cetera. And so that's one sort of thing that I've been thinking a lot about. How do we take a collaborative experience within a classroom and bring it to a distance education setting? Let me now tell you, though, a little bit more about how I see collaborative work happening in my classroom. So I'm going to walk you through two different simulations that we did and kind of talk a little bit about that process and what we had students doing. So the first simulation is a situation where each person in the classroom is assigned to be a country in an environmental treaty negotiation, okay? And so they could either be assigned as a country, or they could be assigned as an economic interest group or an NGO, et cetera, okay? And then the goal is for them to come together and see if they can negotiate a treaty that would then pass to save the world, okay? This was in particular modeled after the Montreal Protocol. So all the stuff that used to be in your hairspray, et cetera, how do we get rid of that, okay? So what's the challenge in doing that? Well, first of all, is the assignment of roles, okay? You have to assign people to particular roles, okay? And in doing that, you're not just telling them, hey, you're Austria. And they're like, okay, I'm Austria. What do I do next, okay? You need to give them a little bit of information. Okay, well, what is in Austria's interest? Okay, what is it that they want out of this negotiation? What are the things that they have perhaps like privy information about? Who are the different countries that they might want to talk to because they could form a coalition? Okay, now you want to give them some of those things, but you don't want to give away the whole thing. Okay. And so this collaborative process then is in part having clear goals and giving the sort of minimum required information to get the wheels going. Okay? And that can be challenging. Let me now speak to, well, we might as well. Is there a clicker? Can we open up my slides? Great. So the second simulation dealt with a situation where there was a crisis that had emerged overseas. Basically, a giant tsunami had hit Bangladesh in India. and the US needed to figure out its response. Okay? Now, this simulation, which is very much a collaborative learning exercise, see, I told you how bad my slides were. How do you just hit
I'll
this
just
thing?
make it really
There we go.
It doesn't.
Oh. This is why I don't use Macs. Yeah, just make it, that's fine. Okay. Where's the, that's fine. You guys can see it. Okay, so here's an example of me with the GoPro on. You can't really see, I'm interviewing people. Okay, so in this simulation, we had a setting where we had to assign people to play different roles in the US government. Okay? And this is really interesting because different agencies play very different roles in responses to disasters. Okay? Now, what is one of the things that we know at least the US government has a challenge with? It's about communication across different agencies. And so part of this collaborative exercise is to figure out who are the different agencies that I need to be going and talking to, right? How is USAID going and talking to the CIA, right? Are they talking to the Department of Defense? How are they coordinating their activities? Then what you need to be able to do is take that experience and take the information and advice that is generated from those conversations, and that then has to be passed to the executive branch. And so literally what we had a group that was the White House, there was a president, and all these different agencies had to come up with relevant information to be able to pass to the executive team, and then the executive team at the end of this class-long session does a press conference, okay, with a press secretary and all of that. Okay? And so there are different challenges that come up about getting students to understand that collaboration within their own group has to be combined with collaboration with other groups, and then that has to be funneled up to a decision maker. And if we all know our bosses, they only want, well, like, what's the simple thing? Like, just give me the top line. Okay? And that's challenging, especially when you're responding to complex events. So how do I think about impact? Impact in these types of exercises, it's student-led, right? If it's properly designed, you just get them going. It's student-led, and that leads to ownership. And furthermore, it leads them to be able to articulate in their own vocabulary. Okay? So this type of collaboration, then, I think is equipping them to be able to understand the concepts we're learning in class, but put it in their own terms, right? That way, we have a lot more ownership there. So stepping back, these types of collaborative exercises take huge upfront investment, right? For the treaty one, I worked with an RA, probably something like 40 to 50 hours, right? Extensive materials, lots of planning, but it's a huge takeaway for the students. Sometimes you have to get that cross-group communication going artificially. So one way I've done that is to designate a student who their responsibility is to go around to different agencies and say, hey, you need to be talking to these people. Who are you talking to, right? To sort of as a catalyst there. I always follow up in the subsequent class by then taking the collaborative exercise and connecting back to the theoretical concepts that are, the sort of bread and butter of the class. So I'll note that this type of collaborative learning is an example of active learning, which is something that is part of a HILT-funded project called ablconnect.harvard.edu. This is a collaboration between IQSS, the Bach Center, the School of Education, and HILT, where we're going around and we're collecting lots of different types of activities. Some of them are collaborative, and some of them are not, but it's part of a larger goal to equip people with research. One of those research examples is at your table, as well as lots of activities in a searchable database. So that's ablconnect.harvard.edu. And so I'd recommend being able to go and check that out. So just to call up the PowerPoint slides one last time. There we go. So now what we're going to do, we kind of just gave you an overview of different types of collaborative work. What they talked about was very different than what I talked about. That's part of the design. But now what we want to do for the remainder of our session is throw you into the mix. And so what we sat back and did is we've created a set of vignettes these vignettes are going to have particular challenges to collaboration embedded in them. Okay? But there are different types of challenges that are embedded within them. And what we're going to have you do as a short exercise is to take 15 minutes in subgroups at your tables. Okay? Or if you all want to just join together because you don't have lots of people at the table, and you're going to come up with a game plan about how you're going to diagnose and then prescribe a solution to the situation that you're posed in the vignette. The way we're going to guide you to which vignette that you're going to use at your table, there are at least 2 vignettes that have a square around them. So if you're a larger table and you're going to split in 2, one side will do one of the squares, the other side will do the other one. If you're at a smaller table, just choose the one that you want to do. And then we're going to do an exercise where we're going to have groups get paired together to be able to share a little bit with each other. We're going to be floating, so please feel free, just raise your hand and we'll come answer any questions about the vignette. And then we'll be able to come back together as a group and do have a discussion. Great, so have at it. Like.
All right, folks. Let's start to wrap it up. Okay, so what we're now going to do is we're going to pair groups up together. The goal is each group is going to provide a very brief sort of, this is what the problem was, and these are what our solutions were. The role of the other group is to get some, beyond simply constructive criticism, but collaborative controversy, right? Push back. Are their solutions really going to work? Right? Are they just pie in the sky about this? Push back on them. Then you'll switch, and the other group will present theirs, and you'll do the same thing. Okay? So all the tables where there are 2 groups at the table, we want you to pair yourselves up. We're going to then pair this table here with this table here, because you all were a single group, and you folks are going to join these folks here. You can negotiate on which table you go to. And this is only going to last 10 minutes total, so each side is doing 5 minutes. Okay? Each side is doing 5 minutes. For the group back here, which is one group, we're going to join you, and we're going to give you a hard time. Okay, so let's come back together. All right, so what we now want to do is have just a couple volunteers to kind of throw out what they felt to be from this experience their best idea, but then to highlight what they thought was the best criticism they got from the other group. Okay? So you want to sort of highlight, hey, like this is the thing that if I only did one thing, this is what I would have done, but also to then highlight what was the best piece of pushback that you got, and maybe even think about how you might respond to that. So let's try to have a volunteer here. No one had any good ideas? Oh, yes, ma'am.
Did you want me to give a background?
Just very briefly, yeah.
Okay, so we had a class that was about documentary filmmaking, and we had the problem that the students were watching a film inside the classroom, and they didn't have enough time to form their own opinions and then share them with the class. So our number one decision was to move the watching outside of the class so that students would have a chance to absorb the material, be devoid from that emotional reaction, and then be able to form some opinions. And I think that the best criticism that we got was that we had focused really on the individual process of reviewing and not on collaboration. We realized that when we read our description, we had interpreted the documentaries as being individual endeavors, but that they very well could have been group projects.
Great, excellent example. All right, let me get another volunteer. Yes, sir.
So sort of synthesizing the talk to our particular problem a little bit. So the gist of our problem was a statistics class, about 15 people, small groups of 5, and they were supposed to come up with a product for an open source statistical program called R. And so I think my big takeaway from that was that it's very compelling to think about some of these collaborative projects on multiple levels, right? So we had groups of 5, so there's a sort of within group collaboration, which I think is a fairly obvious one. but then there's some dimension of the class which needs to have between group collaboration, as this group of 5 explains what they did to this group of 5, explains what they did to this group of 5. And so that's a key part of the learning. But then the one that I have, and I've done a little bit of that in my own teaching, but the place I need to get to, I think, is there's this whole R community, which is a real live thing that's out there. And so there's also this collaboration with a real world outfit entity, which can keep the learning going from the class, I think, in a much more profound way than just sort of deploy examples out in those class. So that was a big thing.
And was there a criticism that you found particularly compelling?
So I do survey design, and these double-barreled questions are just too much for me to answer. I've given you all I could.
Great, thanks. Let's get another volunteer. You guys sounded like you had lots of great conversation going on.
We did. We just never came up with we were in number 1 because we had a 100-student gen ed course on social media course, and we hit a 0. And the question was, what do you do from the outset to make it successful? So we spent most of our time talking and believing that to be successful is about the correct assignment of groups, and then we kind of fell into the rabbit hole. What does that mean? How big should a group be? How do then the small groups react to the large groups? And how do you facilitate and help the groups become groups? And then how much direction do you give the groups on where to find materials? And then we started asking questions about how transparent are the goals of the group, and how do they keep the group's norms themselves, or how do we impose the norms onto the group? And one of the criticisms was that, do you allow the group to normalize on its own and create its own goals as a unit, or do you do that from the outset as a faculty kind of exercise? And so I'm not sure if we landed on something, but we meditated on that as well. But the assignment of the groups and the orchestration of how the groups work is the key to successful collaboration.
Yeah, no, it's definitely valid.
Maybe get 2 more. Yeah, go ahead.
So our group looked at an undergraduate upper-level philosophy course, and the decision had been made that for the midterm there would be, people would be put in groups of 3 to collaboratively work on a paper on that topic. And one thing that came out in our initial group was allowing the groups to form based on shared learning goals. So asking students early on to identify what their learning goals were for the course, and then pairing or putting them into trios so that they had shared goals. But a comment that came up when we shared that was, will they know enough at the beginning of the course to be able to even articulate what their shared learning goals were? And so that kind of at least caused me to second guess something that seemed like a great idea.
Yeah.
So our question was about this multidisciplinary course with 30 undergrads, grads, and mid-career students. And the course is about handling a number of problems through thinking about startups and the problems and the challenges that can face startups. And the problem here was that when the students are split into groups, the groups that have interpersonal issues, the students are normally in these groups, the students have difficulty giving feedback. And we thought that this actually is even a bigger problem, because these groups probably have the more important feedback for everybody else. So we thought about doing collective, when the feedback is done on the group level, but also at the class level. And at the class level, we thought about doing crowdsourcing of feedback using electronic media, and this would allow for more removal of the personal issues a little bit, so that distancing the students a little bit from the experiences that they have using this sort of electronic medium would help, and also shifting the groups around and having more, so the feedback wouldn't be around this particular group, but more general, and also some form of structured feedback that would allow students to address questions that are not necessarily, that sort of cannot be easily addressed. And the most important feedback that we got, or criticism that we got, is that this level of anonymity that we can do with the electronic source may actually make the feedback itself less effective.
Knowing who is giving you that feedback actually make you more motivated to address it.
Right.
That's really interesting.
Good. So if anyone else wants to share, so we thought what we would do for the last 10 minutes is to sort of open up the conversation. Like we've tried to provide a somewhat structured experience for this, but of course there are always like lingering questions that people might have, or just sort of comments based upon your own experiences that you'd like to share with this group. So I'll turn it over to Kyle to kind of run that part. And so if you want to facilitate that.
Who wants to begin? So the one question that we had was figuring out metrics for not just success, but just how you approach knowing, like, if you're trying to change something or do something differently, you're doing something better, or if it's just different. So this is always a question of education, and this always also linked to the goals. What's the real metric for evaluating an act of teaching, and whether or not you're doing a good job, or what you should be doing with the students? The metrics. Any follow-up response to the teacher? Analysis.
Just a clarification question. Are you thinking in particular, or wondering in particular about metrics for evaluating the impact of collaborative learning structures, or more broadly just the impact of teaching?
Well, we heard this morning that we have this Twitter culture, and we have Q guides and all this, and the danger that deans just look for, who has the most popular course or all this, and these seem to be the default metrics is what the students are doing. Is that the appropriate metric? Is there something we could try to put in? Is there something we want to do for ourselves to know if we're being successful at teaching at least what we want to teach?
Maybe one thing that I've thought a little bit about is how do I embed knowledge that should have been gained in the collaborative experience in my traditional examinations, right? So on my final exams, I will have questions that would enable someone to bring to bear the experience that they had in one of the collaborative simulations. And so, and I'm explicit about that, right? This isn't just you can, if you bring in that experience, you'll get a couple more points. It's you should study that experience and reflect on that experience in order to perform well on questions on my final exam. That's one way, but the metrics issue is of course a very deep one. So, yeah.
So I want actually to follow up on a point that a previous speaker made, which was what if the students don't already know a whole lot, right? Because our first presenter pointed out iteration feedback, that seems like one of the great things that we can get out of collaborative work, because the students are set up to speak to each other. And that works great if everybody's already really skilled. But very often, say you have an intro level class and you want the students to give feedback to other students, how do you do that in such a way that the feedback is on point and actually helps the students reach a goal that either you've decided as faculty member, this is what I want students to do, like I want them to be able to write a philosophy paper, or at least get better at it. How do you do that when you have novices? So I know this came up in the previous report, and I'd just love to hear more about it, because I face that all the time, and I have no idea how to do it, and I was hoping today I would learn.
Well, it's important. I've thought quite a bit about this, so especially in courses that are effectively, students are trying to come up with startups or similarly projects. In one of the early slides, one of the core things at the individual level is domain expertise. And it used to be that the way that this happened in the university was that was embedded in the project through the professor. And now students are doing a lot of projects where domain expertise is actually not really embedded in the project. And then I think that instead of that being a bad thing, it's actually an opportunity for us to find ways to add technology, through technology, reintroduce that domain expertise. Hunter, is it? Like, I think your example of the R community being an option to do that is really interesting. So how do we then redesign their projects so that we can access domain expertise in new ways?
I think also there's the trajectory over the sequence of a class that, you know, the very first simulation I'll do, you don't even need to know that there are other countries in the world. Right? I mean, fortunately our students are a little bit further beyond that. Right? But that, you know, over the course of the semester they're going to get increasingly technical, right? So providing that sort of on-ramp. Yeah.
So what should be the goal of learning? Should it be knowledge acquisition? Should it be domain expertise? Should it be asking questions? Should it be collaborative work? Or should it be getting to the end of the project successfully, the 30%? And how should we assess that as opposed to knowledge acquisition?
I think it depends on the class, and the assessment should be structured based on what the goals of that assignment are. Another thing that I do that I think is helpful around the domain expertise and around the how do you know if something is working is I have ongoing peer evaluation and a weekly check-in, and I basically ask 3 or 4 questions. Very simply, it takes less than a few minutes to answer, and it's what's going well in your project, what's not going well, what are you learning this week? Actually, the second one is structured as is what is frustrating about your project. And the last one is optional. Is there anything that we can help you with? And that's surprisingly effective. It will come up. It will come up if it's an issue with other students. It will come up if it's an issue with not understanding the material. And it's about forming the habit of the students to do that.
So just a follow-up question to that. How do you decide when to intervene, particularly when the dynamics are off and your students have flagged this for you, but it's not explicitly tied to their grade, and so it's hard to incent the one outlier to then work in the collaborative process? How do you make that decision as to when to intervene versus letting the group work itself out?
I try to create an environment that's very open so that if there are any issues, they come to me pretty quickly. So it's the first part of that. But then when issues arise, usually the initial issue comes out as blaming someone else, and the way that I respond to that is, well, tell me about your role in this. And it leads to an interesting discussion, and there's always a role in it. And it really depends on the exact problem, but it does change the nature of that discussion. Usually,
depending on the content of the class, you can kind of turn that into a teachable moment. So, like, I face problems with some types of collaborative projects where there's the classic free rider problem. There's that person who isn't doing stuff. Well, it turns out I also teach about free rider problems more generally, right? And so just sort of, if there's any way that you can connect that dynamic that's emerging from the group to actual content that's in your class, that's a win. That's not always possible, of course. So, yes, ma'am.
We talked in our group a little bit about assessing the project as a whole, with the premise that the group work would be, you know, we firstly came to this, oh, group work is great, but then there were many questions. How do you assess that? What are the different ways? So I'm curious to know if you have any examples of how you've done that successfully.
So is the question about assessing the group project versus individual performance?
The collaboration. You assess the collaboration of the group. Per se, I guess. Per se,
Yeah.
rather than the product? Right. Yeah.
So the product I assessed through inter-rater reliability. So I have multiple experts in the area, independently rated. And the collaboration, I purposefully don't make, there's no grade for it. There's a participation grade. And in the 4 years of that class, I've changed this. It's a really difficult problem. So it's about creating a safe environment for them to learn and not pretending that there's one way to do it, right? And assessing it almost by nature sometimes is the right answer. And so what I do is this pretty complicated data-driven process where it's multiple expert raters, peer and self-evaluation every week. And so it's a lot of information that basically does give a pretty good sense of that individual's role in the group. And then we have a midterm and an end of class private conversation with each student about, like, here's what this says. Does this more or less match your experience? And for everybody, strengths and weaknesses will come out of that. And that's not to say that you can't be very successful being a demanding, slightly disagreeable person, but there are costs to that, and we'll talk about that. We'll talk about how other people might not want to continue to work.
So I think we have 2 questions. Why don't we just both pose them, and then we'll have a final wrap-up.
Well, Beth, you actually answered, I think, for began too. I was curious as to both of you, how do you build opportunities for student metacognitive practice, that is, for students to be able to reflect on their own learning as part of that process, because a lot of times collaboration assumes that students know how to do it, or that students know how to self-diagnose, address a problem, and resolve it. We were talking about, for example, when you intervene, and I'm curious if you build opportunities for students to solve problems themselves.
So one thing that I've done a little bit of, and I would like to do more of it, is trying to get people to sort of abstract away from the details of the particular collaboration and say, okay, well, you guys have to collaborate in other walks of life. What are the aspects of this collaboration that you're going to extract and be able to apply? Are there things that you commonly tripped up over? You know, those sorts of things. The downside of that is that I have less opportunity to deliver content of the class, but my sense is that it's well worth taking that extra step. Do you want to?
Oh, I was just going to say one other model for assessing group work is business school. We're going through our 4th year of our field program, where in the 3rd module we give teams of 6 $5,000. They have to start a micro business in 3 months and bring it to viability. Not all teams are able to do that, and so for the teams that are successful, there's a track for successful teams. For the businesses that fail, we have a failed business track, and it's the responsibility of the failed business track to evaluate why did their business fail, what were the aspects of it, what would they do differently. Because if you think of the startup culture, startups are going to fail, but you're going to iterate, you're going to learn, you're going to continue to grow. And so with group work, if group work completely goes off the rails and fails, that doesn't mean there still is learning. There may even be more learning in there. And if you can extract some of those aha moments from the students when things fail completely, that's another way to evaluate group work.
Well, I think despite our technical difficulties with the AV stuff, this has been a successful session, and I thank you all for being so willing to come in and collaborate and dig into some different situations and provide feedback to each other. So thank you very much on behalf of the